Welcome back for our second evening with Lynn on the resurrection narratives. Just to remind you, some people wrote to me again today. I got a number of emails that the link is only going to go out after 4 p.m. on the day of the class. Okay, we're only collecting the list once because people still sign up on the day of the class. So you'll get your link, and if you've forgotten what I told you last week, your link is the same for the entire time, okay? We send you a new one assuming that you're going to lose yours, but if you keep it, that's wonderful. And the other thing I want to tell you is some of you have written to ask where is the recording, okay? So Matthew, our Spiritual Life Tech Assistant, has put Sister Lynn's this class, in a playlist by itself, okay? So if you go to the Spirit of Life homepage and you hit recordings, it will take you right to YouTube, our YouTube page, and you can look up her playlist. A playlist just means like a little file with all of the classes that she will be giving us on the resurrection narratives. So Sister Lynn, welcome back. Thank you. We're looking forward to hearing this.
Thanks, Maria. So good evening or good morning, wherever you are, and welcome back. And I am going to share the screen. Okay, is that okay, everybody? Can you see?
Uh-huh.
All right. So last week we were looking at some of the basics about resurrection, ascension, exaltation, and how it's all really kind of the same mystery. So this evening, we're going to look at the empty tomb narratives and then get into Mark's resurrection story. Next week, we'll be doing probably Matthew and Luke. I want to work in the Gospel of Peter somewhere, and I'm not quite sure where we'll get that. The following week, just to give you some sense of it, we'll be certainly doing John. And then the final week, I want to spend on 1 Corinthians 15, because I think that's really the key to the whole thing. So we're looking at the empty tomb this evening. So some problems. This is not the earliest Easter story. If we're correct that the Gospels are written after Paul, Paul is our first witness. And Paul talks about appearances, resurrection appearances. He never mentions the empty tomb. It's not continued in Acts. Now, Luke, the author of Luke and Acts, we assume, knows certainly the empty tomb story. He has a very nice rendition of it in the Gospel. When Peter and Paul start preaching about the resurrection, they never mention it. Possible allusion twice in Acts 2 and 13 with the quote from the Psalm 16:10, you will not allow your faithful one, you will not abandon your faithful one to Sheol, nor allow his flesh to see corruption. And that's applied to Jesus. Okay, so maybe that's alluding to an empty tomb, but it's pretty vague. 7 times in Acts, in the preaching, we are witnesses. And the witnesses, what they're witnessing to is the appearances of Jesus, not an empty tomb. Why? Why not talk about the empty tomb? Well, there have been a number of reasons suggested, and one of them is because of body snatchers, because it's too easy. Somebody just removes the body from the tomb, and they say that he's risen. So it would be a cover-up, you know. Remember that in Matthew's gospel, they set guards at the tomb to be sure that his disciples don't come and take the body and say he's been raised. Well, Jesus gets out anyway, if you remember, and the guards are in trouble because they have failed in their duty, and they are bribed to say that they were asleep on the job, and he got out anyway. The disciples, that is, the disciples came, took the body, and left. But remember Mary Magdalene in John's gospel. She sees two angels sitting there. She's weeping. They say, "Why are you weeping?" "Because they've taken the body and I don't know where he is." And then later on, she sees Jesus, thinks he's the gardener, and says, "If you've taken him, tell me where he is." So again, an idea that the body could be taken by the disciples or by somebody else. They, who's they? For Mary Magdalene, we don't know. So that's one possibility. The other, or another one is that it depends completely on the witness of women. Were they discounted? Were they not believed? Is it because of legal constraints on the testimony of women? And there certainly were some. Women were not normally legal witnesses in trials or in official situations, and this certainly would be a very serious kind of a witness as time went on. Is that the reason? People like Paul even are embarrassed to say that the first appearances were to a group of women or only to Mary Magdalene. That's a possibility. So why is it there at all? Why is the empty tomb story there if they can't use it, you know? And one of the suppositions on the part of many is that it's secondary and therefore legendary, that it's not historical. That would explain it. The earliest testimony is of appearances. And then as time moves on, they begin to elaborate on them. And you can see in the resurrection narratives, Jesus gets more and more concrete as they go. But then my problem with this is, why tell it this way? Why, if it's secondary, if it's made up, why have the women be the witnesses? Why not have an official visit to the tomb by Peter and the other 10? They're down to 11 now without Judas. And they go to the tomb and they could witness to it. No, it is this story with a group of women. So what do women have to do with tombs and burials? Well, it turns out quite a bit. It's one of the ways of saying this is that women control the doors of birth and death. Birth, that's rather obvious, but also death. They are connected with burials, with cemeteries, the preparation of the body for burial is usually done by women in these kinds of cultures. The rituals of burial, belief that women have access to magic formulas, that somehow they can have control of the body, that by witchcraft, they can conjure a raising of the dead. All of this is connected in the culture with women. And here we have women going to the tomb. Public mourning is another element on this. Even to the point of hiring women to mourn at funerals, because the mourning for the dead is connected with women. So does this have something to do with why you have women going to the tomb? Our earliest account, as I said, is 1 Corinthians 15, and there are no appearances to women. Kathleen Corley is a New Testament scholar who has written on this, a book called Maranatha, and she's working on another one now. She argues that women are excluded from the account because of the association with unsavory cemetery practices, the kinds of thing I was just talking about. There is certainly a tradition of Jewish veneration of the holy dead, and that's not limited to women. Even now, in places like Tiberias in Galilee, there are tombs of some of the holy men of the rabbinic period, and people come on pilgrimage, and women, men as well as women. there is, on the way to Bethlehem, between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, is the tomb of Rachel, which is a favorite pilgrimage place for Jewish women. So the connection of women and death is there in the culture. Paul says he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. And that has made its way into both of the creeds, the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. He was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. Why the third day? Well, the only scripture passage that we can think of in connection with that is Hosea 6:2. The Lord will strike us down on the second day, and on the third day will raise us up. And that could be the scripture passage. That's probably the scripture passage that Paul is thinking about there, and we'll do more with that another time. But there's also, apparently there was a belief that the spirit of the deceased would kind of hang around the tomb for 3 days, and then on the fourth day, leave. And there were third day mourning rituals that particularly women engaged in, coming to the tomb to mourn on the third day. Well, these women are coming on the third day. For us, it kind of doesn't make sense. Friday afternoon to Sunday morning doesn't seem like 3 days, but it is pieces of 3 days, because the way of counting includes the day that you're on. You know, we count differently. So women lamented the dead at grave sites, and they were associated with these mourning songs that in some cases were meant to raise the dead from the grave. And the women were believed, especially older women, were believed to be in direct communication with the dead. So women's laments were considered a powerful form of magic that could stir up the dead. And so it's pretty fearful, you know, it's pretty awesome. Apuleius was a 2nd century novelist, and in one of his stories, this is written in Roman Africa, mid-2nd century, and this character is hired to stand watch over the remains of a man the night before his funeral to make sure that the man's corpse is not mutilated by witches. And he hesitates to take the job. He says, "I greatly fear the blind and inevitable hits of witchcraft, for they say that not even the graves of the dead are safe, but the bones and slices of such are slain to be dug up, such as are slain, to be dug up from tombs and pyres to afflict and torture the living. And the old witches, as soon as they hear of the death of any person, go and uncover the hearse and spoil the corpse before it's even buried." So this is legendary stuff, you know. I mean, he's sort of letting his imagination go wild. And remember, this is a novel. But that kind of thing is indicative of the kinds of superstitions that surrounded burial and surrounded the role of women, the older women, especially widows, hanging out at the tomb and engaging in a lot of mourning. Remember the Witch of Endor? This is about 1000 BC. King Saul is in trouble. God has decided that he's not going to be king anymore. And he tries to get an answer from God, and he says that it says that he didn't get an answer in dreams or in Urim, which we think are some kind of a casting of lots, or the prophets. He doesn't get any other answers, so he's going to go to a so-called medium, you know, a witch. But the trouble is, he had banned this kind of activity in Israel. So he goes after dark and disguised to this known witch, medium, and asks her to bring Samuel back from the dead. And she says, "This is a trick, you know, King Saul has forbidden this. I can't do this." And he assures her that it's going to be okay. So she does it. She engages in her witchcraft, and brings Samuel up from the dead. And she says, I see a divine being coming up out of the ground. Samuel is not happy to be disturbed from his rest, but he has to respond to this, the power that she has. And when Samuel appears, King Saul bows to the ground, but Samuel has no good news for him. It's that he's not going to be king anymore, and disaster is coming. But this is a really interesting story precisely because it shows this belief 1,000 years before the time of Jesus in the ability of some women to do this kind of thing, to actually consort with the dead and call them up from wherever they are. The women in Mark's account are silent. That isn't true across the board. Mary Magdalene in John is weeping, and you needn't think of that as silent weeping. That could be loud mourning, but it doesn't say that the women in Mark's account do that. Empty tomb stories, these empty tomb stories, may have been passed on by women's oral networks, not directly involving the men for a while, until they finally make their way into the written Gospels, which are probably written by men. But it's quite likely that the earliest levels of the stories of the women at the tomb were passed on by women. So even though the women were there to perform third-day rituals, that's what it means by their coming back to anoint the body. That's a mild way of saying it, But they're portrayed as silent in the story to avoid accusations that Jesus is forced from the grave by witchcraft and magic and not by the power of God. That's Kathleen Corley's wording of it. She is the person, the scholar who does the most with this whole accusation of magic and witchcraft and that kind of thing, which certainly may have been a part of it. So let's take a look at Mark, the end of chapter 15, the end of the Passion story, and then into this pretty brief account that Mark has. At the death of Jesus, this is in chapter 15, it says that there are 3 women there. Doesn't say anything about men. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, who's also appears earlier in chapter 6, and Salome, and many other women who had come with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. We don't pay enough attention, I think, to the background statements. We tend to think just a few people at the cross, but really, if you read it carefully, it names those 3, but then it says that there are many other women who had come with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. Only women, no men. How many women? Doesn't say. It says many others, whatever that means. And then in verse 46, Joseph of Arimathea has a tomb. And in John, it's only in John that this is a new tomb in which no one had been laid. And Mark does not say that at all. He says that Joseph goes to Pilate and asks for the body of Jesus. When it's already evening, since it's the day of preparation, which is the day before Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, we know of no place named Arimathea. This is a total mystery as to where this place was supposed to have been. And it says he's a distinguished member of the Council of the Sanhedrin. So he's an official, a Jewish official, but someone who was himself awaiting the kingdom of God. He's not mentioned before this. It sounds a bit like Simeon and Anna in Luke's scene in the temple with the baby Jesus. Both of them are waiting for the salvation of Israel, the glory of Jerusalem. So it doesn't say he necessarily believes a whole lot in Jesus, but I guess you can assume that he's awaiting the kingdom of God. Why else would he do this if he didn't have some belief in Jesus? He came and it told me us he dared, he took a risk to approach Pilate and ask for the body of Jesus. Now, the usual thing for people who were executed as criminals on a cross was no burial. The body stayed on the cross to be, you can imagine, eaten by birds, etc. That was part of the usual thing. Though there certainly were other examples known of families who came and either furtively sneaked the body off the cross or had some kind of official permission to do it. And so it doesn't say how Joseph is related to this group of people from Galilee, you know. But he took courage and he went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. It says Pilate was amazed that he was already dead. Yeah, because the more ordinary thing was that people would last for days and really die of dehydration or whatever. And Mark's account really says it was about 6 hours, from about 9 in the morning to about 3 in the afternoon, and that he died quickly. And if you recall in Mark's account at the death of Jesus, it says that the centurion said, indeed, this was a son of God, not the son of God, but a son of God. Seeing the way he died, the centurion said, indeed, this was a son of God. We don't really know what that means. I think Mark is playing on it because of the whole role of Jesus as Son of God, as the one especially beloved by God. This is the transfiguration. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. But seeing the way he died, and courageously, quickly, we don't know what that means, actually. So Pilate is surprised that he's already dead. He asks the centurion, and he ascertained that Jesus had already died. And so he gave the body to Joseph. And it says that having bought a linen cloth, he took him down, wrapped him in the linen cloth, and laid him in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. One assumes his tomb, or a tomb certainly where he had a right to bury somebody. It doesn't say that, but I think you can kind of assume that. And he rolled a stone against the entrance to the tomb. So there's been not much preparation of the body for burial. Ordinarily, there would be wrapping of the body with spices, an anointing, and it sounds as if that they didn't do that because the Sabbath is coming. It's late in the afternoon, and the Sabbath begins at sundown, you know, on Friday. But it says that Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Joseph, we don't know what happened to Salome. She went home. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph watched where he was laid. And the verb that's used there, the watched, is a verb that is often used for contemplation. It's not just the ordinary word to see. They pondered it. You know, they watched it carefully. and watched where he was laid. Again, no male disciples involved of the inner circle. I guess you could call Joseph a disciple. Doesn't say anything about whether any of the men, the inner circle, were around. Doesn't say that they knew where the tomb was. Later on in John, you've got the beloved disciple and Peter running to the tomb, but you don't get that here. It's just the women and Joseph. Now, when pilgrims later came in the 4th century and in the time of Constantine, that's when they began getting interested in trying to find the tomb. And according to tradition, there were some memories that preserved the real location of it. And if you were a pilgrim in the 4th century at the time of Constantine and Helena, you would have come to this church. And the dome, the Anastas's dome on the left, is the dome today that is over the rotunda of the tomb. But it's this is the structure of the Constantinian church. You had the main road. This is a main road from north to south from Damascus Gate, what is now Damascus Gate. And then over here, there was a closed basilica, rather, an open courtyard, and then another structure that went over the tomb. If you've been there today, this is the familiar picture that you see from the time of the Crusaders. The church here, and then an extension, another building on its left. And as you probably know, if you have been there, there's nothing in there that looks anything like a tomb. But this is the kind of tomb area that it would have perhaps looked like. You can see on the left that there's a block in front of this tomb. It was to have a rolling stone on it. The rolling stone is not the majority kind. Usually sort of square stones that you could just put in there is more common, but there are a good number of evidence of rolling stones. But you see on the picture on the right, they can actually have metal doors and stone doors as well. This is the so-called garden tomb that is up maybe no more than a quarter of a mile north of Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. It's a tomb that was in use and reuse again and again and again from probably 800 or so BC into Roman times and even Byzantine times. And it's set in a lovely garden, and it's administered by a Scottish Presbyterian group. And you can see again the track where there was a rolling stone there that is not to be seen at all anymore. And the garden tomb dates from the 1890s, and a British explorer who was not satisfied with what you see in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today, because it's quite a cultural clash for Westerners, a sort of a chaotic place there. And this, I think there's no chance that this is the authentic tomb of Jesus, but it serves the purpose of being a place where Westerners can come and feel at home and be quiet and pray. But you can buy a replica of it for $85 if you want, complete with rolling stone. This makes the claim of being the best rolling stone tomb in Israel, and it's actually in southern Galilee. But there you see quite well on the left side there what a rolling stone looks like. They're big. There's no way that two women could roll one of these things, you know. Though they aren't necessarily always that big, because sometimes the entrance is much lower and you have to stoop to get inside. And then the diagram, the sketch on the right side, shows you what to expect inside one of those tombs. They're not always that big. but there's an open space in the middle, and then either shelves or these what are called locally sort of places that you can slide a body in. And they practiced what's called secondary burial around this period. I meant to put a picture of an ossuary in here, and I forgot. But coming back a year after the burial, gathering the bones, putting the bones into a much smaller limestone container, and then keeping that in the tomb and reusing the burial space. That was a quite common practice. So one can assume in Mark's narrative that that the body of Jesus is put into some kind of a tomb that's not only one body. I mean, they just weren't like that. They were family tombs for many possible burials. So Mark 16, this is the resurrection story, the empty tomb story for Mark. So when the Sabbath is over, so now it's Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome's back into the act now. They bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. This is the third day ritual, you see. And it's very calm. The narrative here is very calm. We don't have any indication of magic or witchcraft or anything like that. But it's on the third day. They are doing the third day ritual. Very early, when the sun had risen. If you check the timing on the four Gospels, every one of them is different. Here, it's when the sun had risen. One of them is while it was still dark. One of them is at early dawn. The time is all different. It's really interesting, but it's early morning. So in Mark, the sun has risen before them, and it's still early. And it's the first day of the week, and they came to the tomb. And they're saying to one another, who will roll back the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb, which is kind of disingenuous. They didn't think of that before. But it's part of the drama. It's part of the way it's constructed, that they're on their way, and they realize they're not going to be able to get in without some kind of help. But they look up and they see that the stone has been rolled back, and it was a very large one. Doesn't say how. Matthew will have an angel come and actually roll the stone away, but it doesn't say. Mark is so simple in the way he tells this story. They simply get there and the stone is back. So they go in. And they see a young man sitting on the right side. It doesn't say angel. Young man in a white robe. And this translation says utterly amazed. Some translations say terrified. They don't know what's going on. This is totally new territory for them. And he says, don't be amazed, don't be afraid, don't be terrified. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's been raised, he's not here. Behold the place where they laid him. So, I know who you're looking for. He's not here. See where he was. He's not here. He's been raised. Simple, simple message. But there's more. Go and tell his disciples and Peter. Interesting, disciples and Peter. Peter is distinguished, separated out. Some kind of a recognition of his leadership, perhaps. Or remember, in Mark as well as in the other Gospels, Peter has denied knowing Jesus. So maybe he's not with them. Maybe he's in a different place. Tell the disciples and Peter, he's going before you to Galilee. And you will see him there, as he told you. There earlier in the gospel, there is a promise of meeting again in Galilee. He goes before you. You're not going to catch up with him. You know, he is on the way and he's going home. Because returning to Galilee is going home for all of these people. So it is in a way saying to them, go home. Go home, go back to the familiar, and that's where you'll see him. The only gospel that does not give them that message to go back to Galilee is Luke, who explicitly says, stay in the city, stay in Jerusalem. It's a direct contradiction in instructions. But Mark and Matthew, Jesus says, go back to Galilee. In John, they simply go there, and he is there. So as he promised you, he will see you there. So they went out, they fled from the tomb, they were seized with trembling and bewilderment with fear. And they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So they don't follow the directions. The directions of the young man are to go and tell the disciples, go tell the message. And they don't do it. They say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now we have a problem, because that, in some of the best manuscripts, is the ending of the gospel. What if that is Mark's intended ending? They said nothing to anyone. It cries for some kind of a completion, doesn't it? Because it would be the failure of the whole mission if that were the lasting message. Remember, in Mark's gospel, the disciples, the male disciples, don't understand. There are all kinds of places in which they just don't get it. And in a way, this would join the women with the male disciples. They just don't get it either. It's a mystery. What we know is that in some good manuscripts, very good old manuscripts, that is the ending. But of course, people couldn't stand that. There are three other endings to Mark. And one of them is considered canonical because it's in the Latin Vulgate, Jerome's Latin Bible, and therefore got into the Council of Trent text, and therefore it's canonical in the Catholic Church. But we're going to look at all three of them, and you sort of judge for yourself. And then go to your Bible and find out what your Bible notes say about these other endings. Usually, one or two are in the text, and one of them is a footnote. So the shorter ending is one verse, and it presupposes those 8 verses that we just looked at, and it concludes them. But they reported briefly to Peter, so they did go say something, and those with him, and all that they had been told. And after this, Jesus himself sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So it all ends happily ever after. A simple conclusion. It has been argued that the author of First Clement, which is probably late 1st century Rome, says about Paul that he preached the gospel from east to west, and the language sounds a little bit like this. So it's been argued that that Paul knew this ending. It's in the manuscripts of the 7th and 9th century, so very late. The freer Logion, not because it's more free, but because it was discovered in a antiquities shop by Charles Freer. early 1900s. And this one is in a few manuscripts, late 4th, early 5th century. Jerome seems to have known about it, and it presupposes and follows verses 9 to 14. So we're going to come back to it when we get to 14. The longer ending, verses 9 to 20, that's canonical in the Catholic Church, as I said, and it is usually there in the text of Mark with some kind of an explanation. But it's missing in the best earliest manuscripts. It's quoted once or twice before the year 325. But it was known to Irenaeus, late 2nd century. And it may be quoted by Justin and Tatian, who are 2 2nd century authors. It's not totally clear. But as I said, the text is in the Vulgate, in the Latin Bible, Jerome's translation. And so it's in the Roman lectionary. And it actually is used in the lectionary. There's actually a Sunday reading when it is used, and then a couple of other weekday readings. So this is the longer ending now is verses 9 to 20. So here's the first 3 verses. And this ending really seems like a summary of the other Gospels, of the other Easter stories of the Gospels. You'll see what I mean. When he had risen early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. Now, the 7 demons or 7 devils you get from Luke chapter 8. And he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, that's John. That's the only gospel where Mary Magdalene is alone and gets a first appearance. She went and told his companions who were mourning and weeping. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. And that's Luke. The women give the testimony of what they've seen, and the disciples don't believe it, the male disciples. Then, verse 12, after this, he appeared in another form to 2 of them walking along on their way to the country. That's the Emmaus story in Luke. They returned and told the others, but they didn't believe them either. But later, as the 11 were at table, he appeared to them and rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had been raised. That Luke and John both have scenes where they're together, particularly Luke at table. John is not so clear that they're eating, but they're all together. So again, allusion to what seem to be other stories in the other Gospels. So it's sort of a summary of the other Gospels. And then he said to them, go into the whole world and proclaim the gospel to every creature. Well, the ending of Matthew's Gospel, go and preach the gospel to all the nations, baptizing, and here's a reference to baptism in verse 16. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. That's rather harsh. But these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will drive out demons and they will speak new languages. Mark, in chapter 3, Jesus explicitly gives his disciples power to exorcise, to drive out demons. They will speak new languages. That's Pentecost in Acts, where everybody understands in their own language. Then now comes the snake handling. This is where the snake handling thing comes in. They will pick up serpents, manuscript variant, with their hands. Some manuscripts don't have that. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not harm them. They will lay hands on the sick and they will recover. Well, and again, in Acts, I should have put the word Acts there because Peter and John, lay hands on the sick and they recover. The thing about poison, about drinking poison, Eusebius, 4th century historian in his church history, has a story about Justus Barsabbas, who's one of the characters in Acts in the early church, the early years. And it's quoted from a writer named Papias, who was mid-2nd century. He wrote apparently lots and lots about apostolic traditions that he knew, and we don't have his books. We only have quotes in other writers. But he said he got the story from one of Philip's daughters. Remember, Philip the evangelist has four unmarried daughters who are prophets. And this is an allusion to one of them, that this happened to Justus Barsabbas, that he was drinking poison and it didn't hurt him. But you also remember, well, this is drinking poison, but remember the story in Acts of the shipwreck at Malta, and there's a poisonous snake that comes out and bites Paul, and they all expect him to die, and he just shakes it off and doesn't die. And there are no poisonous snakes in Malta now, but that's the story. But verse 14, back to 14 for a minute. Later, as the 11 were at table, he appeared to them and rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he'd been raised. We've already looked at that. Now, this Friarologian takes up from there. And they excused themselves, saying, this age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the spirits. This rather glum mood. Therefore, reveal your righteousness now. Thus they spoke to Christ. Christ, not Jesus, not Lord, but Christ. Christ replied to them, the term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, that they may inherit the spiritual and imperishable glory of righteousness that is in heaven. So that's quite a different take. It's a different style than the other two endings. And this one, as I say, is usually put in a footnote, acknowledged, but put in a footnote, and it's not well attested, but it is in some manuscripts as an ending. So continuing with verses 12 to 20, the longer ending, or 9 to 20, sorry. So then the Lord Jesus, after he spoke to them, was taken up into heaven and took his seat at the right hand of God. Both Luke, the end of the gospel, and the beginning of Acts has Jesus being taken up. Remember last week I said how important that right hand of God is at Psalm 110, verse 1. And where does Jesus go when he goes up? He goes to the right hand of God, which means he's second in command. But they went forth and preached everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the word through accompanying signs. So again, a kind of a happy ending. You know, it's hard to end this. Every gospel writer struggles with how do you end this? You know, Matthew just has them on a mountain, and he says, "I'm go and preach the gospel, and I'm with you all the days." It doesn't say he took off for heaven. You know, they each have a different way of dealing with this. But let's just think for a moment about presence and absence. You know, I think I said last week that ascension is absence. It's Jesus leaving. And in a way, resurrection Mark is also absent. He's not there. He doesn't show himself. He doesn't appear, unless you go with the second ending. But with the ending at verse 8, he's going before you, and there is the promise that you will see him. I like Mark's ending. I like ending at verse 8 because it leaves us hanging. There's a suspense in the story. It's an unfinished story, and it has to be carried on and completed in other ways. Mark is not going to tell us how he really wants to finish it. As you can imagine, there's just all kinds of things that have been written about this, and it ends on a really odd note, and there are literary examples of other stories like that that just sort of end hanging in the air. That's where Mark leaves us, unless you go with one of the other endings. There's no appearance. There's no reunion. It's go home and you'll see him there. So a question for you, which is your ending? Which, if you have to live out Mark's gospel, what are you going to go with? I think it's worth reflecting on. Just for fun, one of my favorite Far Side cartoons. And again, just for fun, I recommend a book to you called A Skeleton in God's Closet. It's available on the usual marketplace. And it's just fun. It's about a Harvard archaeologist who is called in by the Vatican to deal with the fact that they have discovered Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, not the one we thought, but elsewhere, and there's a body in it, and it's clear from the inscription that it's not Joseph. So it's an interesting thing, and dwell on this. There used to be a Jesuit biblical scholar named Irish named Jared O'Collins. I don't know if anybody remembers that name or knew him. I remember that he wrote an article in, I think it was in America, probably in the late 60s, that began, if someday the bones of Jesus should be discovered in Israel, would that cause trouble for belief in the resurrection of Jesus? And he said, no, it wouldn't. So, and I think he's right. So I think we continue to wrestle with the mystery, and that's kind of the way it is. So here we are.
Questions, you can put them in the chat box and Lynn can read them, or you can raise your hand. I saw someone had a hand up before.
Yes, I saw that.
I don't know who that was, but if you want to come back and ask a question now, please do. Rita, do you have a question? Was that you with your hand up? Rita Houlihan?
I was just no, I hadn't raised my hand, but I'm formulating one. I need a second to gather my thoughts, so I'm coherent.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's a lot to think about, huh?
Lynn, while she's formulating her thoughts, could you just help us understand? So have any authors said that, because it says young man and not angel, have any authors tried to make the case that this was Jesus speaking to these people, but not recognizable at that point, just as Mary Magdalene had not immediately recognized Jesus in the garden and mistook him for a gardener? So has anybody
That's an interesting idea. I don't know that anybody has. He would be then speaking about himself in the third person.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
Speaking about himself in the third person. It's funny because you read these things all the time, but I'm listening to you and watching it on the screen. I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, what if if it was he in the third person, then he
Mhm.
would be risen, but
And
not
still hanging around the tomb.
yeah, exactly, but
Mhm.
not recognizable.
Mhm.
Um, and as opposed to Jesus in John's gospel, who finally says, don't cling to me. I have to send to my father and your father. This is just someone who doesn't choose to identify, and leaves the women thinking that they're just talking to a young man. Because you wonder what are they terrified about? Are they terrified because there's no one in the tomb, or they're terrified because they're talking to a person inside a tomb who's
Well, first of
alive?
all, that the tomb is open.
Yeah, right. That
Yeah.
too.
And then there's
Right,
somebody in there they don't recognize. Yeah.
right.
What are you doing here?
Yeah, and you don't expect to be talking to a talking person once you enter
Yeah.
inside a tomb.
Yeah,
So
right. That's right. Yeah. You know where I thought you were going, Maria? I thought you were going to say, has anybody suggested that this was the young man in the Passion narrative who has the linen wrapped around
right,
himself and flees naked? That has been suggested.
no,
That yeah, and nobody knows what to do with that story. Um,
Okay, so now,
okay, Rita's got a question.
now I have my question. Actually, I have two. But first, I thank you very much for this and for the first session. I loved your idea or I think it's yours, of returning to Galilee is going home.
Mhm.
And because that word home is used so somewhat, I guess, freely in different gospels, you don't know if he's going back to Nazareth or going to Capernaum, but I just like that idea of going home.
Mhm.
And one of the things that also that I love is how explicit this young man is when he says he's going before you. There you will see him, meaning I think that the women, and it's not just the 11, but the women are going to go back to Galilee, which is
Yeah.
really important.
The whole
And then he adds, as he told you, which points back to the prediction, at least one prediction scene
Mhm.
where women aren't named, of course, but that would indicate that they're there. And if I may, I just love to add an allusion or an image that Carla Ricci has sort of spun in her Mary Magdalene book, which you recommended to me. That at this point the male disciples are scattered, very likely scattered and afraid, and that the women have to go find them and collect them. And she says maybe they had to convince them to leave their fear and follow them and go back to Galilee. And I just love that image. And she says it's like the women at this moment form a tenuous thread. I think that's the word she uses, between the rest of the disciples, which could also include women who are in fear as well as men, and the ability to, like, I guess, experience the risen presence, even though that's not really a concept in Mark. But and it's just a really beautiful image, I think, of that extra step of these three women, pivotal in the formation of the new community. Yeah. And then the last, yeah, okay, I'll let you respond to that.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say the last image, because when I teach this in confirmation classes, I'll say to the kids, so they're going back to Galilee. Now they've been on this road before, and many miracles have been performed, and Jesus taught them many things. It'd be like going on a family trip where you see old familiar sights. And then I keep having this imagination of that their faith gets rebuilt as they sort of have this memory journey, in a way, re-experiencing the Galilean ministry and mission. Anyhow, it's just, that's how I do like Mark.
Yeah, I do too. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rita. I'm sure you're all familiar with this idea that from Calvary to the empty tomb, the women are the church. They are the continuous thread, as you said, and that's Ricci. Yeah, the continuous thread where you just don't know where the male disciples are. They're not there. That's an absence too.
Thanks.
Lynn, I think you have one question in the two questions in the question box. Can you see them?
Yeah, Sunday's gospel is a transfiguration. Is it correct to associate this with the resurrection or a prefiguration of it? Yeah. Many people think that the transfiguration is in fact an Easter appearance transposed back into the lifetime of Jesus. It's really interesting that there's no transfiguration in John. And people say, you know, the entire gospel is transfiguration. You don't need a specific scene for that manifestation of glory. I think it is right to associate that with resurrection, prefiguration of it. It's a sneak preview of the risen Jesus, of what it's going to be like when he has been raised. Yeah. Women are often the midwives of life and death. Is the association of women and magic about the fear of the feminine brings new life to birth? Oh, absolutely. But also understands death as part of life, not to be afraid of. Yeah, I think that's a very good comment. The fear of the feminine, the fear of the one who can give birth. It's the fear that the one who can give birth can also give death. You know. The control of life. Yeah.
I think in the question box, somebody said, resurrection, why wouldn't it be a problem if Jesus's bones were discovered?
Okay, well, I want to quote a well-known, used to be long dead now, theologian Edward Schillebeeckx. I don't know if anybody remembers him. Dutch Dominican theologian who wrote some wonderful things about ministry and sacraments and all that kind of thing. And when I was at Catholic Theological Union, he came one time. It was in the late 80s or early 90s, and gave a talk and was around, was available, etc. And we were actually sitting around, a group sitting around in our living room one evening when we got on the subject of resurrection, and he kept saying this: resurrection, yes. Resuscitation, no. And that's what Paul understands. We will really get into that when we do 1 Corinthians 15. Paul does not understand a resuscitation of a corpse. It seems as if some elements of the gospel do. So we have different understandings going on. And then also in the question and answer, the issue of women misogyny witches, as not mentioning the empty tomb in Paul, albeit women present. Wondering why would women be mentioned at all in the gospel narratives if the witches' medium labels were so present? Yeah. I mean, that's my argument too. Why have women there if it's a secondary thing, if there's no historical basis there? Why have women? and why risk that connection with magic and all of that kind of thing? Well, Kathleen Corley's answer to that is, the partial answer is, that's why the testimony of the women was not used in the preaching of the resurrection. So that's at least a partial answer. But yeah, I mean, why have women at the tomb at all? A lot of unanswered questions. I think maybe we have more. No, it's the same ones.
No, but can we go back to what you said about Skillibeaks and, resurrection is not the resuscitation of a corpse. Okay, so I'm assuming you're referring to when Paul talks about the pneumatic body. So, right. So maybe you could just expand on that a little bit so people understand.
I don't want to spill all the beans now.
Oh, okay. Are you saving that for
That's
okay later on? Okay, fine.
Yeah,
That's fine. Because I think for a lot of people, I'd say, well, if you're not gonna, if your body is not gonna be resurrected,
what's the point?
what's a resurrection
Yeah,
body?
what is a resurrection?
Okay, we'll save it for your next one. Anybody else? Any questions or comments? I was just thinking, we always think of Luke as being the gospel that showcases women because he mentions so many women. But, if you take a step back and listen to everything that you said tonight about Mark, the three women and then some other women, I mean, he also gives in a very subtle, non-pronounced and not using particular women with names kind of prominence to these women at the end being there and being the ones who accompanied Jesus from Galilee. So as much as people have tried to suppress the presence of women in the early, in the life and times of Jesus in the early Jesus movement, I mean, you just can't get around it. They're there. And I think it gives us women something to think about in terms of our own life today and our presence, in the church and how important it is. I think Rita has
something from Rita.
Yeah.
There's an argument that women are only witnesses, so the evangelist had to include that the women were the only witnesses, huh?
Right.
So the evangelist had to include them. Is that probable? Well, maybe. I mean, yeah, if they want to say anything about the tomb, it has to be women. Could it just have been appearances and no empty tomb story? Could have been, but it's, I don't know. I mean, I think for us, we see a kind of a balance there of the empty tomb and the appearances, but the resurrection faith is based on appearances. I mean, that's very clear in Paul. That's very clear in the preaching in Acts. And the problem there is when they begin to narrate them, they don't include the appearances to women. Usually, I mean, some do. You can see that second ending of Mark does, for example. That's a problematic piece of it. But it's according to the culture. I mean, in one sense, it's not surprising. So we've looked this evening at some of the ways in which, or some of the reasons, some of the potential reasons why the women get short shrifted there, even though they can't not include the women. And that, and if you're going to talk about the tomb, it has to be the women, So, okay, there's something else here. To bring a happy ending, was it finally about giving women a role that fitted with the cultural context of women's expected role? Okay, to look after the body of the dead. Women often are those who wash the body of the dead, whether nurses or close relatives. Yeah. Women's expected role has to do with dealing with bodies, live bodies, babies, and dead bodies, corpses. And they partially stay in that role here. Later you're going to have appearances. So in Matthew and in John, you're going to have appearances to women. But here, unless, as Maria says, that young man in the tomb is really the risen Jesus, you don't have that. More to come.
Somebody asked, were there any references to resurrection in non-biblical literature in this time?
I missed the first part of that, Maria.
Would there be any references to the resurrection in non-biblical literature in this time?
Well, yeah, there's the whole theme of dying and rising gods. And some want to make more of that than others, but certainly gods who are partially mortal, but then they return to life after being killed. The Egyptian one, Osiris, yeah, who was killed by Seth and dismembered. And Isis goes around the world collecting the parts of his body and brings him back into life, resurrects him, raises him from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a powerful thing, and the participation of the goddess, the woman, to do that. Again, it's connecting women with birth and death and new life. That's an example. That's the most outstanding example. So it's not unknown outside of Jewish circles.
Anyone else? Well, this was another great, interesting night with a lot of interesting information. And I think we all have a lot to think about as we leave tonight. Just to remind you, Matthew will get if you weren't on at the beginning, Matthew will put up the recording as quickly as possible. He edits and puts things up. So within about 48 hours, the easiest way to get the recording, if you want to listen to it again, is to go to Spirit Alive homepage and to click the recordings button, and then you'll see a file, a little playlist that has all of these presentations by Lynn there. So thank you all for coming tonight. Maybe we can just stop for a minute and pray in a special way for the children, for all the children in Gaza who are starving and are innocent, just innocent, and are starving and dying for other people's wars. And then for all the children in Ukraine who are here, 3 of whom were here at the United Nations this week. They were part of the thousands of young Ukrainian children who were removed from their families forcibly and taken to Russia to be indoctrinated as Russian citizens. So for all those children who are frightened tonight because they're away from their mothers and fathers, and the others who are hungry and starving, we ask you, oh God, have mercy on those children. Amen. Thank you, everyone. Good night now. See you next Tuesday.
Thank you. It was great.